to be the mother of one of the finest recording stars in the country.
Well, we're really proud of him, everything.
The record he's got out, which I guess is one of the biggest records.
Never defined who I am.
Glen Campbell was about as all-American as it gets, with incredible hits like Universal Soldier, Southern Nights, and of course, Rhinestone Cowboy.
Like a rhinestone cowboy.
He represents an America that kinda doesn't even exist anymore. Mr. Campbell sadly passed away in 2017, surrounded by his friends and loved ones. But now his children are making shocking claims about Glen's final days and who was really in control. So just why did Glen cut 3 of his kids out of his will? Did they really neglect their father when he was alive? Or was Glen's last wife, Kim, really pulling the strings the entire time? Today we're exploring Glen Campbell's exploding legacy, who he really was, which of his wives hated his music, and who saved him from drug addiction and despair. Was Glen Campbell really the man we thought he was? Before we begin, make sure to give this video a thumbs up to show your support, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new video. Now you ready? I can promise you this, by the time you get to Phoenix, you'll know a side of Glen that you never thought existed. So come on and let's go find out.
What happened?
A young charmer. When Glen passed away, he was a devoted family man, surrounded by his doting wife and his loyal children. But Glen wasn't always that way. During his life, he had 8 children by 4 different women. So what's the truth behind the rest of this sprawling family? And why did Glen cut 3 of his kids out of his will? When Glen met Diane Marie Kirk, he was hardly the superstar he would eventually turn into. No, he was just a cocky kid from the Southwest who could pick a mean guitar. She was 15, he was 17. Then she was 15 and pregnant. Glen married her immediately and they had 2 kids, but only one survived infancy. Then it wasn't long until Glen hit the road. Now his second marriage was more promising. He went and found a new girl from New Mexico. The gal in question, Billie Jean Nunley, was a beautician, and they were married for 16 years and had 3 kids together. But the cracks started to appear as the years went by. Billie Jean grew more distant. So what was the problem? Well, according to Glen, she just didn't like his music very much. But of course there was another reason for the divorce, even if Glen wouldn't admit it. It was the 1970s by then, which meant that a musician with some cash in his pocket could get access to just about anything he wanted in the world. So as Glen's career developed, he was also getting hooked on illegal substances and also alcohol. A new Glen was developing, and not everybody was a huge fan. The big time. Glen Campbell's 3rd marriage was a more controversial affair. See, Glen was good friends with a fellow musician named Mac Davis, who also had some pretty good hits, like the 70s joint Baby Don't Get Hooked on Me, which is a phenomenal song.
Baby, baby, don't get hooked on me.
Glen would spend lots of time with Mac and his wife Sarah, who he took a particular interest in. Of course, Glen was wise enough to keep this interest under wraps, but he could actually sense there was trouble in Mac's marriage, and this was good news for Glen. One day, Glen and Mac were out golfing together when Mac sadly broke the news that he and Sarah were divorcing. Glen, like any model gentleman, comforted his friend, but immediately after he left, he called up Sarah. Not long after that, he called up People magazine, telling them he and Sarah were going to get married as soon as the papers were in. I suppose Glen Campbell was never much for the subtle touch. After 4 years of married life, Glen and Sarah had a baby boy named Dylan. But immediately after that, Sarah divorced Glen for unknown reasons. I guess neither she or Glen believed very much in waiting around. Now Campbell's next serious relationship was with the stunning country singer Tanya Tucker. Glen was determined not to take his bombshell for granted, saying, quote, "I'm dating one of the finest female talents that God lets draw breath." On her 22nd birthday, he threw her a $57,000 birthday party. But at the end of the day, this flash and glitz was all there was to the relationship. as Glen was falling deeper and deeper into addiction. As you can imagine it, the money kept coming, and so did the illegal substances. The next woman Glen would meet, for more than one night at least, would forever change his life. But could she save him? Only if he could live long enough to let it happen. Kim. Glen Campbell met Kim in 1982 on a blind date. She allegedly had a very great personality, but I'm sure it helped that she was also a Radio City rockette. Glen claims it was love at first sight. They would have 3 children together, but unlike Glen's other children, some of whom he wasn't always close with, these 3 kids were always in the picture. And years later, Glen claimed that Kim and their children helped save him from drug and alcohol addiction. Now, of course, it's unfair to accuse Glen Campbell or any parent of having a favorite child. Except, of course, my parents, because I am their favorite. But if Glen had to choose, it's hard to argue that he wouldn't choose these 3 kids with Kim. And why not? They were a part of his new life, full of stability, sobriety, and a wife with a rockin' bod. I mean, how can you say no to that? So these are the kids who joined Glen on stage when he toured in 2010. But remember, Glen had 8 children by 4 different women, and if you've already forgotten about them, you better remember, because they weren't gone for good. The downhill. In 2011, Glen was diagnosed with the dreaded disease Alzheimer's.
In all likelihood, your difficulties are due to Alzheimer's disease.
This would kick off a fierce battle for his legacy, his love, and of course his money. So who was really responsible for what happened? As you probably know, Alzheimer's is one of the most horrible diseases to get or to deal with. It turns husbands and wives into strangers, the present into an eternal past. But for a while, Glen was making the best of it. There was a documentary and several books made about him, even as he was unable to move or talk very much. The great Glen Campbell passed away in 2017, but it was what happened next that truly shocked people. When Glen's will came out, people were astonished to see that 3 of his children were completely shut off. Not just left out, it was written that they wouldn't see a dime of their late dad's stash. So who was responsible for this? It seemed like there was only one person who had enough control over Glen to make such a thing happen. And her name was Kim, and she used to be a rockette. Pulling the strings. The facts are pretty damning. Glen definitely wasn't all there in those final days, but Kim sure was. And she was the executor of Glen's will. But was there foul play, or was Glen in control of his actions? So, these 3 spurned kids fought back in court. And that wasn't all. 2 more kids claimed that while Glen was struggling with Alzheimer's, Kim was up to no good. They said she was mishandling his money, neglecting him, and wringing as much cash out of him as she could while he was still breathing. But Kim was having none of it. She said, quote, "That was all done in 2002, and that was a choice that was made by Glen, not me, and there were reasons for it." She says that Travis never visited his father in the 20 years prior. And she didn't even reserve her anger for those kids. She also came at Tanya Tucker. She said, "This Tanya Tucker, who dated my husband for a hot minute 35 years ago, going on TV the day after my husband dies, promoting Forever Loving You and exploiting my husband." Yeah, Kim was having none of it.
It's a nightmare to have people on the internet, threatening to kill you because they think that you're this horrible person that wouldn't let people visit, which is totally false.
The verdict. So who is right? It is kind of impossible for me to say. What we have is a total he said, she said situation. On one hand, Kim was Glen's devoted wife and stood by him in his final decades. But on the other hand, she did have lots of control over Glen in those declining years. She definitely could have wiped those kids from the record. But shockingly, she wouldn't have to keep up the fight, as Glen's rejected kiddos are now giving up the fight. Is it because they never really had a claim? Or was the legal battle just too taxing? Only one thing is for certain. Kim has fought hard to maintain control of the Campbell legacy, and she has succeeded. We often think that entertainers are like the movies and songs they star in. There's always a good guy and a bad guy. One true love that puts all the rest to shame. But in life, this just isn't true. Most likely, there's truth to both sides of the story. and it's possible that Glen had a part to play in all this drama too. At the end of the day, we'll never really know who the man was like. All we really have is the music. But lucky for us, that music is so damn good.
Like a rhinestone cowboy.
Alright, that's enough of me. Now we need to hear from you. Give me a favorite song or a favorite record. Did you ever get to see Glen perform live? Are you a fan of Tanya Tucker as well? Get in the comments and tell me all your Glen Campbell memories. Did any of you get to meet him? We look forward to reading your thoughts. If you enjoyed our Glen Campbell deep dive today, please give the video a thumbs up, it really helps. Subscribe to our channel and come back often so we can keep telling you
What happened?